It was a normal morning in a small town where life moved at its own slow pace. The streets were quiet except for the sound of tools clinking and the hum of engines coming from a small workshop at the corner. Inside, a man in his mid-30s worked patiently under the hood of an old car. His clothes were marked with grease and his hands looked worn from years of labor. Yet there was a calm expression on his face, the kind that comes from someone who takes pride in honest work. He wasn't rich, but he was respected in the neighborhood. People brought their cars to him not just because he charged fair prices, but because he treated everyone kindly. He never argued, never cheated anyone, and always greeted his customers with a gentle smile. For him, fixing cars wasn't just about earning money, it was about helping people get back on the road safely. His little workshop might not have had shiny tools or bright lights, but it was filled with sincerity. That morning, as he wiped sweat off his forehead, an old school friend pulled up in a sleek black car. The man inside looked almost unrecognizable. Expensive suit, gold watch, and the confidence of someone who had seen success. When he stepped out, he called out in surprise, "Is that really you? You still working here?" The mechanic smiled, nodded, and reached for a towel to clean his hands. They exchanged a few words about old times. The friend talked about how life had changed for him. His business, travels, the house he bought near the city. The mechanic listened quietly, happy for him. Then the friend said he was planning a big birthday party at his mansion the following weekend, and insisted that the mechanic should come. "It'll be a reunion," he said cheerfully. "Everyone from our old group will be there. You must join." At first, the mechanic hesitated. It had been years since he had gone to any social gathering. His life revolved around his workshop, his small rented home, and his family. He wasn't used to fancy places, but the friend was persistent and said he would send a formal invitation anyway. The mechanic smiled politely, though deep down, he wasn't sure if he belonged in that world anymore. Later that evening, as he sat at his small dining table eating with his younger sister and mother, he mentioned the invitation. His sister's eyes lit up. "You should go," she said excitedly. "It's good to see your old friends again. Don't worry about what you'll wear or how big their house is. You deserve to enjoy yourself too." He smiled softly but didn't answer right away. He looked around at his home, the peeling paint, the simple furniture, the old radio that still played songs from the past. He wasn't ashamed of what he had, but he knew how people could be. He had met enough customers who looked down on him because of his job. Still, his sister's words stayed in his mind. Maybe it wouldn't hurt to go, even if it was just for one evening. The week passed quickly. Work at the garage kept him busy, but every now and then he found himself thinking about that invitation. He had kept it on the table, still in its envelope, as if waiting for a sign. The day before the party, he decided. He would go. He didn't have fancy clothes, but he took his best shirt to the laundry and polished his only pair of shoes until they shone as much as they could. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The evening of the party arrived. The mechanic stood outside his small home, adjusting his collar in the reflection of a car window. His sister handed him a small wrapped box. "A gift," she said with a smile. "It's simple, but it's from the heart." Inside the box was a handmade keychain shaped like a car, something his sister had crafted herself. He looked at it and nodded. "Thank you," he said quietly, touched by her thoughtfulness. He borrowed a friend's motorbike and started his ride toward the mansion. The city lights grew brighter as he got closer. The road widened, the houses became bigger, and the air itself seemed to carry the scent of perfume and money. When he reached the grand gate, he saw a long line of expensive cars parked neatly outside. A security guard looked at him, slightly puzzled, before asking for his name. The mechanic gave it politely and was let in. Inside, the mansion was glowing with light and laughter. Music played in the background, and waiters moved around carrying trays of drinks. The guests were dressed in glittering clothes, talking loudly about business, travel, and success. The mechanic stood at the entrance for a moment, trying not to look out of place. His friend, the host, noticed him and came over with a big smile. "You made it," he said, shaking his hand warmly. "I'm so glad you came." For a few moments, the mechanic felt comfortable. His friend introduced him to some people, and they chatted about school days. But as soon as the conversation turned to careers, things changed. Someone asked what he did now. He replied honestly, "I run a small auto repair shop in town." There was a brief silence, followed by a few polite smiles. Then one man chuckled and said, So if my car breaks down, I know who to call." The group laughed softly, but the tone was clear. It wasn't friendly. The mechanic smiled awkwardly, pretending not to notice. He looked down at his drink, feeling a little out of place. Another guest, a woman with a diamond necklace, added, "It's nice that you still work with your hands. Not many people do that these days." Her words sounded like praise, but her expression said otherwise. He just nodded politely. As the night went on, the laughter around him grew louder. People talked about things he didn't understand. Business mergers, overseas trips, new cars, and luxury brands. He stood quietly at the corner, occasionally sipping from his glass of juice, trying not to draw attention. Every now and then someone would ask him something, not out of genuine interest but out of curiosity about how the mechanic lived his life. He didn't blame them. They came from a different world now. But what hurt was the subtle mockery, the looks, the whispered jokes, the way they treated his presence as entertainment. He thought about leaving early, but his friend, the host, kept insisting he stay. "Relax, have fun," he said, unaware of how uncomfortable his guest felt. During dinner, things became worse. While everyone gathered around the long table, one of the men made another joke. "Careful with your fork, my friend," he said loudly. "You might get oil on it." The table erupted in laughter. Even the host smiled awkwardly. The mechanic froze for a moment, his face turning red. He forced a small smile, trying to hide how much it stung. He wanted to disappear, but he said nothing. He finished his meal quietly, his appetite gone. Every sound of laughter around him felt heavier. When no one was watching, he stood up, walked to the garden, and took a deep breath. The night air was cool, and the lights from the house glowed in the background. He looked up at the stars and let out a slow sigh. A small smile appeared on his face, not out of happiness but peace. He wasn't angry, just disappointed. He had expected kindness, but what he got was mockery. Still, as he stood there, he realized something. Their laughter didn't define him. Their words didn't change who he was. He had built his life with his own hands, earned every meal with honest work, and never disrespected anyone. They might have more money, but he had something they didn't: dignity. He knew who he was, and that was enough. After a few quiet minutes, he decided to leave. He walked back in, found his friend, and thanked him for the invitation. The host seemed surprised. "You're leaving already?" he asked. "The party's just getting started." The mechanic smiled gently. "I have an early start tomorrow," he said. "There's a customer waiting for his car." He handed his friend the small wrapped box his sister had given him. "A little something," he said. "It's not much." The host accepted it with an awkward smile. "You didn't have to bring anything," he said quickly, clearly unsure what to do with it. The mechanic just nodded, wished him a good night, and walked out of the mansion. As he rode home through the quiet streets, the laughter from the party faded behind him. The road was empty except for the sound of his motorbike and the cool wind brushing against his face. When he reached home, his sister was still awake, waiting. "How was it?" she asked eagerly. He smiled, placed a hand on her shoulder, and said softly, "It was beautiful." Then he went to his room, took off his shirt, and sat by the window. He looked out at the night sky again, thinking about everything that had happened. For a moment, he felt a hint of sadness, but it didn't last. Somewhere deep down, he knew life had its own way of teaching lessons. People could laugh all they wanted, but time would reveal everything. He just didn't know yet that the same people who had laughed at him that night would one day remember him for something they'd never forget. The next morning began like any other. The sun was just rising over the rooftops, and the sound of birds filled the air. At the small garage near the corner, the mechanic unlocked the door and got to work. He tried to focus on the car in front of him, but his thoughts kept going back to the party. The laughter, the whispers, the way they looked at him. It all replayed in his mind again and again. He wasn't angry anymore, just thoughtful. Maybe they didn't mean harm, he told himself. Maybe they were just caught up in their world of luxury and pride. But deep inside, a quiet voice reminded him that the world often judges by appearance, not character. And no matter how kind or humble a man is, there will always be those who measure worth in money. He pushed the thought aside and continued tightening a bolt under the hood. A young boy who helped him part-time arrived soon after, cheerful as always. The mechanic smiled faintly, grateful for company. Work had a way of calming his heart. The sound of tools and engines made more sense to him than people's laughter ever did. As the day went on, customers came and went. Some paid on time, some asked for credit, and he never refused anyone who was truly in need. When a taxi driver came in, worried about his broken brake light, the mechanic fixed it quickly and said, "Pay me later when you can." The man smiled gratefully and said, "You're a good soul. Not many like you left." That small sentence made the mechanic's heart feel lighter. He didn't need approval from the wealthy. The respect of ordinary, hard-working people meant more to him than any party invitation ever could. By evening, he was tired but satisfied. He locked up the garage and walked home, stopping on the way to buy a few groceries. His sister met him at the door, asking how his day went. He smiled and said, "Busy as always." He didn't mention the party again, and she didn't ask. Some things were better left unsaid. A few days later, the weather changed. Heavy clouds covered the sky, and soon rain began to fall in sheets. It was late at night when his phone rang. He almost ignored it, but when he saw the number, he hesitated. It was unfamiliar yet local. He answered anyway. A worried voice came through the speaker. The man on the other end said his car had broken down on the highway, and no one was picking up his calls. He had found the mechanic's number through someone in town. The mechanic could hear the rain pounding hard in the background and asked for the location. It was quite far, almost at the edge of the city. But without thinking twice, he said, "I'll be there soon." He quickly grabbed his raincoat, toolbox, and a flashlight, then kicked his motorbike to life. The streets were slippery and the rain blurred his vision, but he didn't slow down. Helping someone in need was part of who he was. When he finally reached the spot, he saw a luxury car parked by the side of the road. Its headlights flickered weakly and the hood was slightly open. Standing beside it, holding an umbrella, was a man dressed in fine clothes, completely drenched and clearly frustrated. The mechanic parked his bike and walked closer, calling out, "Need some help?" The man turned, and for a moment both froze. It was the same host from the party, the man who had once been his friend, the one who had laughed along with the others. The host's face changed instantly, from surprise to embarrassment. "You?" he said softly, almost in disbelief. The mechanic gave a small nod, then looked at the car. "Engine trouble?" he asked calmly, as if the past didn't matter. The host hesitated, then stepped aside. "Yes, it just stopped suddenly. I don't know what's wrong." His voice was quieter now, almost humble. The mechanic opened the hood and shone his flashlight inside. Despite the pouring rain, he began working with steady hands, checking wires, pipes, and the battery. The host stood silently beside him, watching. Every time the mechanic wiped the rain from his face, the host felt a stronger sting of guilt. After a while, the mechanic found the issue, a loose connection in the ignition system. He fixed it quickly, tested the engine, and soon the car roared back to life. The host's eyes widened in relief. "You did it," he said quietly. The mechanic nodded, closed the hood, and took a step back. "It should be fine now, but try to get it checked again tomorrow just to be safe." The host stood there speechless. The rain had softened into a drizzle, and the silence between them felt heavy. He reached into his pocket, took out his wallet, and held out a few bills. "Please take this. You came all the way here in this weather. I insist," but the mechanic shook his head. "No, that's all right," he said kindly. "I was just doing my job. You were stuck and I was nearby. That's all." The host lowered his hand slowly, guilt washing over his face. I'm sorry," he said after a pause, "for that night at the party. I shouldn't have allowed anyone to speak to you like that. You didn't deserve it." The mechanic gave a faint smile, but it wasn't bitter. "It's in the past," he said quietly. "I don't hold grudges." He picked up his toolbox and turned toward his motorbike. The host stood watching as the mechanic started the engine and prepared to leave. The rain glistened on the road, and the red taillight of the bike flickered in the distance until it disappeared completely. The host remained there for a long time, unable to move. His expensive car was running again, but his heart felt heavier than ever. He realized in that moment how wrong he had been, how small his pride looked compared to the dignity of that simple man. When he reached home that night, his wife noticed his quietness. "You're drenched," she said, handing him a towel. "What happened?" He didn't answer right away. He sat down, staring at the floor, still lost in thought. Then he said softly, "I met someone tonight. Someone I should have respected long ago." The next morning, the mechanic was back at his workshop, fixing a small van. His clothes were still a little damp from the night before, but he didn't mind. When the boy who helped him arrived, he told him about the late-night repair, laughing lightly as he described getting caught in the rain. He didn't mention who the customer was. There was no need. Around noon, a car pulled up outside. It was clean and polished, standing out among the older vehicles usually parked near the shop. The mechanic looked up and recognized it immediately. The host stepped out wearing simple clothes this time, no watch, no fancy jacket. He looked almost nervous. The mechanic put down his wrench and walked over. "Morning," he said politely. The host smiled faintly. "Good morning, I wanted to see you, and to thank you again." "You already did," the mechanic replied with a calm voice. "I'm just glad your car's running fine." The host nodded, then looked around at the small workshop, the oil stains, the tools, the half-repaired cars. He seemed to see it differently now, not as a place of dirt and noise, but as a space built on hard work and honesty. "You have a good place here," he said. "It shows how much effort you put in." The mechanic just smiled. Compliments didn't mean much to him, but sincerity did. "I also wanted to apologize properly," the host continued, his tone soft. "I realized last night that I've been living with the wrong idea of success. I thought respect came from wealth, but you showed me what real respect looks like." The mechanic didn't interrupt him. He simply listened, his expression calm. "I don't expect you to forgive me easily," the host went on, "but I want you to know that what you did last night, I'll never forget it. Not just fixing my car, but treating me kindly after the way we treated you." The mechanic finally spoke. "There's nothing to forgive," he said. "Everyone learns in their own time. I just do what I believe is right." "That's enough for me," the host nodded slowly. For a moment there was silence, just the faint hum of tools in the background. Then he said, "If you ever need anything, help with your shop, your business, please let me know. I'd be happy to support you." The mechanic shook his head gently. "Thank you, but I have everything I need." "I'm not rich, but I'm content." The host smiled, this time genuinely. "I understand," he said, "and I respect that." He extended his hand and the mechanic took it. That handshake was simple, but it carried the weight of understanding, of two worlds meeting halfway. When the host drove away, the mechanic stood watching for a moment before turning back to his work. He didn't feel proud or victorious, just peaceful. Life had come full circle in its own quiet way. As the sun began to set that evening, he sat outside his shop sipping tea and watching the road. The air was cool, the sky glowing orange. He thought about everything that had happened over the past few days. The party, the laughter, the storm, the broken car. It was strange how life had tied it all together, teaching lessons without a single harsh word. He smiled softly to himself. People could insult him, misunderstand him, or look down on him, but none of it really mattered. What mattered was that he stayed true to who he was, a man of work, heart, and patience. And somewhere deep inside, he knew the story wasn't over yet. The world might still have more tests for him, but now he felt stronger, wiser, and unshakably calm, because sometimes dignity doesn't need to shout. It just needs to stand quietly like a mechanic fixing a broken engine under the rain, proving with his actions what words could never express. Days turned into weeks after that night on the rainy road. Life slowly returned to its usual rhythm for the mechanic. He spent his mornings repairing cars, afternoons checking orders for parts, and evenings sitting outside his workshop with a cup of tea. The world around him hadn't changed, but something inside him had. That meeting in the rain had left him with a quiet satisfaction, not because he had proven anything, but because he had stayed true to himself. He had faced humiliation and answered it not with anger or pride, but with kindness. It was something his late father had always told him. When people mistreat you, don't lower yourself to their level. Let your actions speak louder. Those words echoed in his mind now more than ever. The small town where he worked was a close-knit place. People had heard about what happened that rainy night. The story spread quietly, how a humble mechanic had helped a rich man who once laughed at him. No one knew the full details, but everyone admired the way he handled it. Customers who came to his workshop began treating him with even more respect. They didn't see him as just a mechanic anymore. They saw a man of dignity. One morning, as he was tightening a bolt on a car engine, a well-dressed man walked into the workshop. The mechanic looked up, surprised to see someone wearing an expensive suit stepping carefully between oil stains on the floor. The visitor smiled politely and said, "Good morning. Are you the owner here?" Yes, the mechanic replied, wiping his hands with a rag. How can I help you? The man introduced himself as the manager of a large automobile company in the city. He explained that he had heard about the mechanic from a customer who spoke highly of his skills and honesty. We're looking for local experts to assist in a training program for young technicians, the man said. It's a short-term project, but it pays well. Would you be interested? The mechanic blinked, unsure how to respond. He had never imagined teaching anyone, let alone working with a company that big. I don't have fancy qualifications, he said humbly. I just learned through experience. That's exactly why we want you, the manager replied with a warm smile. We believe experience teaches what books cannot. Think about it and let us know. He handed him a business card and left. For the rest of the day, the mechanic couldn't stop thinking about it. He had spent his whole life repairing cars for others, and now there was a chance to share what he knew. It felt strange but exciting. That night, he showed the card to his sister. She grinned from ear to ear. You have to do it, she said. This is your time, see? Hard work always finds its way. He smiled at her enthusiasm but still felt uncertain. What if I'm not good enough to teach others? He asked softly. His sister placed her hand on his arm and said, You've been teaching people all your life without realizing it. Every time you help someone, you teach kindness. Every time you fix something, you teach patience. You don't need a certificate for that. Those words settled in his heart like a spark of courage. The next morning, he called the manager and agreed to join the training program. When he arrived at the company's training center, he felt a mix of nervousness and pride. The place was huge, filled with advanced tools, machines, and young trainees in uniforms. Some looked at him curiously when they saw his simple clothes and worn-out shoes. But once he began explaining how an engine breathes, how each small part works together like a heart and veins, they listened in silence. He spoke not like a teacher from a book, but like someone who had lived the lessons. His voice was calm, his examples real. When a trainee struggled to fix a loose valve, he knelt beside him, guiding his hands patiently. You have to feel the sound, he said softly. Engines talk if you listen carefully. By the end of the week, everyone respected him. Even the company manager personally thanked him for his dedication. You have a gift, he said. You don't just fix machines, you inspire people. Back at home, his sister noticed how he smiled more these days. His eyes had a quiet shine, but he never let success change him. He still opened his small workshop every morning, greeting customers with the same warmth. One afternoon, as he was repairing a car, a familiar vehicle pulled up outside. It was the same luxury car from that rainy night. The host, his old school friend, stepped out. This time, he wasn't wearing his expensive watch or formal clothes. He looked simple, almost humble. The mechanic looked up and smiled faintly. Car trouble again? He asked lightly. The host shook his head and returned the smile. No, he said. I came to see you. He paused for a moment before speaking again. That night when my car broke down, something changed in me. I kept thinking about how you helped me without a word of anger. You made me see what real class is. Since then, I've been trying to become a better person. The mechanic listened quietly. The host continued. I've started helping people too. There's a small community near my area, poor families who fix old cars for a living. I've been supporting them. But I came here today because I want to do more. I want to work with you. The mechanic frowned slightly. Work with me? Yes, the host said eagerly. You have skill and I have resources. Together we could open a training center here for young people who can't afford college. We could teach them mechanical work just like you taught me a lesson that night, without saying a word. For a long moment, the mechanic stayed silent. He looked around at his small workshop, the old wooden shelves, the scattered tools, the smell of oil and dust. He had built all this from nothing. The thought of expanding it into something that could help others made his heart warm. But he didn't want to make decisions driven by emotion. After a while, he said quietly, if we do this, it should never be about money or name. It should only be about giving people a chance. The host nodded immediately. Agreed, it's about giving back. That day marked the beginning of something new. Within weeks, they started setting up a small section beside the workshop, transforming it into a learning space. The host helped with the construction costs, while the mechanic trained the first group of young learners. The smell of metal and oil mixed with the sound of laughter as the students worked together. Some came from poor families, others from broken homes, but they all shared one thing: a hope for a better future. The mechanic treated them not as students, but as equals. He told them stories about patience, honesty, and pride in their work. "It doesn't matter what others think of you," he often said. "What matters is how true you stay to your own values." Word about the training center spread quickly. Even people from nearby towns came asking if their children could join. Soon the place was full every weekend. The host would visit often, bringing food for everyone and helping wherever he could. The same man who once laughed at a poor mechanic now swept the floor of a small training center with his own hands. One evening, when the day's work was done, the mechanic stood at the doorway watching the sunset. The sky was golden and the air smelled of rain. The host came and stood beside him. "You've changed my life," he said quietly. "I can never repay that." The mechanic smiled softly. "You already have," he said. "You learned to see people with respect. That's all I ever wanted." They both stood there silently, watching as the last rays of sunlight faded. The world around them was still the same, but their hearts were lighter. As night fell, the mechanic walked home with tired hands but a peaceful mind. His sister met him at the door, asking how the day went. He smiled and said, "Better than I ever imagined." That night, as he sat by the window, he thought about how strange life could be. A simple invitation to a party had once brought humiliation. That same night had led to a moment in the rain that changed everything. What once felt like an insult had turned into an opportunity to teach others what true respect meant. He realized that sometimes pain isn't meant to break us. It's meant to shape us. Every insult, every struggle, every hard day at the workshop had led him to this point. A place where he wasn't just fixing cars anymore, he was fixing lives, one heart at a time. And as the cool night breeze brushed against his face, he whispered softly, "Maybe that's what real success looks like." The days had turned cooler as the rainy season started rolling in. The workshop smelled of wet dust and oil. The sound of rain tapping on the tin roof mixed with the clinking of tools and the hum of engines being repaired. Rafiq stood near an old car, wiping his hands with a cloth, his shirt sleeves rolled up and a calm look on his face. Life had gone back to normal for him. The humiliation from that night at the party was still somewhere deep in his memory. But it no longer hurt him the same way. He had learned to let it go. Every morning he opened his small garage before sunrise, made tea on a small stove, and waited for customers. Some days were busy, some were slow, but he never complained. Work gave him peace. He had stopped thinking about fancy people or their opinions. What mattered was doing his job well, treating everyone with honesty, and living with dignity. One late evening, the rain poured harder than usual. The streets were almost empty except for the sound of thunder and passing trucks. Rafiq was about to close his workshop when his phone rang. It was an unknown number. He answered, thinking it might be someone with a broken car nearby. A panicked voice came through. "Brother, please, can you help me? My car just stopped on the highway. I've called several places, but no one is willing to come in this weather." Rafiq hesitated for a second, looking out at the heavy rain, but then said, "Send me your location. I'll be there." He quickly grabbed his jacket, some tools, and got into his small van. The rain made it hard to see the road, but he kept driving slowly. The headlights reflected off the wet asphalt and thunder cracked above him. After 20 minutes, he saw a luxury car parked on the side of the road with its hazard lights blinking. When he stopped behind it, the driver's door opened, and a man stepped out, holding an umbrella. The moment Rafiq's headlights hit his face, he recognized him instantly. It was the same man who had hosted the party, the one whose laughter had cut the deepest that night. For a few seconds, Rafiq froze. The man's expensive suit was soaked and his face looked worried. The rain made everything seem like a strange dream. The man's eyes widened too when he recognized who had come to help. He looked uncomfortable, like he wished it were anyone else. But in that moment, none of that mattered. Rafiq turned off the engine, stepped out into the rain, and said softly, "Let me see what's wrong." The man hesitated, then handed him the car keys. It just stopped suddenly. "I don't know what happened. I tried everything." Rafiq nodded and opened the hood. Steam rose from the engine. He didn't say a word about the party, didn't remind the man of what had happened. His focus was only on the car. Rainwater ran down his hair, soaking his shirt completely. His hands moved quickly, checking the battery, the plugs, and the wires. His calmness surprised the man, who stood quietly, watching the mechanic work under the downpour. After a few minutes, Rafik said, "Your alternator belt is loose. That's why the engine isn't getting power." He took out a wrench and got to work tightening it. The rain kept falling and cars sped by, splashing water on them, but Rafik didn't stop. He was used to hard conditions. It was just another night for him. The man watched silently, realizing how much effort and skill went into this simple-looking job. He felt a strange guilt rising in his chest. Memories of that night came flooding back. The laughter, the jokes, the way everyone had looked down on Rafik. He remembered how Rafik had stayed quiet, how he'd walked away without a word, and now here he was standing in the rain, fixing his car like it was nothing. In less than 30 minutes, the engine roared back to life. The car lights came on, and a sense of relief washed over both of them. Rafik closed the hood, wiped his hands with his cloth, and smiled. "It's good to go now. Try it once." The man quickly got into the driver's seat, turned the key, and the engine purred smoothly. He stepped out again, looking embarrassed but grateful. "You really saved me tonight," he said, his voice low. "Thank you," Rafik just nodded. "It's all right. Be careful driving in this weather." The man reached into his pocket and took out his wallet. "Please, at least take this for your time. You came all the way out here." Rafik shook his head gently. "No need, you were an old friend once. Let's call it a favor between friends." The man stood there, stunned. His throat tightened and he didn't know what to say. The rain softened into a drizzle, and the sound of water dripping from the trees filled the silence. Rafik turned to leave, getting into his van. Before he drove off, he looked through the window and said quietly, "We all have bad days. Take care." Then he drove away into the misty road, leaving the rich man standing there under the dim streetlight, feeling smaller than he ever had in his life. The drive back to the workshop was quiet. Rafik didn't feel any pride or revenge. He felt peace. He had done his duty, just like any other job. But deep inside, there was something healing about that night. Life had given him a chance to respond to insult not with anger, but with kindness, and that made him feel truly strong. When he reached his workshop, he parked the van and sat there for a while, listening to the rain on the roof. He thought about how strange life could be. The same man who had once mocked him in front of everyone had now depended on him when no one else would come. The tables had turned, but Rafik hadn't needed to say a single harsh word. His actions had spoken louder than anything else. The next morning, the rain had stopped and the air smelled fresh. Sunlight peeked through the clouds and Rafik opened his shop as usual. His assistant asked him, "You came back very late last night. Who was it?" Rafik smiled faintly and said, "Just someone who needed help." He didn't explain more. Some stories didn't need to be told. The satisfaction was enough. Meanwhile, across town, the man who had hosted the party sat at his breakfast table, unable to eat. His mind kept replaying the image of Rafik working in the rain, silently fixing his car. He felt an ache in his chest, a deep regret for the way he and others had treated that man. He had money. He had comfort, but in that moment of crisis, all he had needed was someone with skill and a good heart. And the person who had shown up was the same one they had insulted. He looked around his big, empty house filled with expensive furniture, and suddenly it all felt meaningless. What good was all this if he couldn't respect another human being? He realized that true value wasn't measured by money or clothes or status. It was measured by character. And Rafik had shown more of that in one night than most people did in a lifetime. That evening, he sat in his car, staring at his reflection in the rearview mirror. The words Rafik had said echoed in his mind. We all have bad days. It was such a simple sentence, yet it carried so much grace. There was no anger in it, no pride, just quiet forgiveness. For the first time in years, he felt humbled. He decided that he needed to make things right, not just for Rafik, but for himself. He couldn't undo what had been done, but he could learn from it. He looked out at the setting sun, realizing how life had its own way of teaching lessons, sometimes softly, sometimes through moments that leave a mark forever, and that night on the highway would be one he'd never forget. Rafik, back at his shop, finished fixing another car and washed his hands. The oil stains wouldn't completely go away, but that was fine. They were a part of who he was, a man who worked hard, lived honestly, and treated people with kindness no matter how they treated him. As he sat down with a cup of tea, He smiled quietly to himself. Sometimes the best revenge wasn't payback or pride. It was peace. And though he didn't know it yet, his quiet act of kindness had started to change someone else's heart forever. The morning after that rainy night, the air was cool and quiet. The city was still waking up, and the roads were wet with leftover puddles. In his small workshop, Rafiq was already at work. He had a car lifted on a jack, his hand steady as he checked the brake pads. The radio played softly in the corner, and a kettle of tea boiled on a small stove. Everything felt peaceful, as if life was reminding him that calmness always follows a storm. He didn't expect anything unusual that day. To him, what happened last night was just another moment, another repair job, another person helped. But to the man whose car he had fixed, it was far more than that. That man hadn't slept much the previous night. The memory of Rafiq working in the pouring rain without a single complaint had stayed in his mind like a quiet echo. Every time he thought about it, his chest tightened with guilt and shame. He kept seeing that image, Rafiq kneeling beside his car, soaked to the skin, his face calm, his hands steady, never once mentioning what had happened at the party. That silence said more than any words could have. By late morning, the man finally decided to do something about it. He got into his car and started driving through the busy streets, the same car Rafiq had repaired just hours before. When he reached the narrow road where Rafiq's workshop stood, he parked by the side and stepped out. For a moment, he just stood there, looking at the small garage that smelled of oil and dust, the signboard faded by time, the walls lined with old tires. He felt nervous. He wasn't used to being the one who had to apologize. But he knew he had to. Rafiq noticed him right away but didn't react much. He wiped his hands on a rag and walked over, smiling politely. "The car's running fine, I hope," he said in a friendly tone. The man nodded awkwardly. "Yes, perfectly. I actually came to thank you properly." Rafiq waved his hand casually. "There's no need. I was just doing my work." But the man didn't leave. He looked around at the small workshop, the cracked walls, the simple tools, the smell of fuel in the air, and then looked back at Rafiq. His voice grew softer. "You don't know how much that night meant to me." Rafiq tilted his head, unsure what he meant. The man took a deep breath. "That night at the party, I said things. I behaved in a way I'm ashamed of. I let people laugh at you. I joined them. I thought being rich made me better. But last night, when you came in that storm, you showed me what real worth looks like. You helped me without hesitation. You could have walked away and I would have deserved it, but you didn't." Rafiq listened quietly, his expression gentle but unreadable. The workers nearby had paused their work, sensing something serious. The man continued, his voice cracking slightly. "I came here today to say I'm sorry. Not just for what I said, but for what I thought about you. I was wrong. Truly wrong." There was silence for a moment, broken only by the hum of the fan. Rafiq finally spoke, his tone calm. "We all make mistakes. What matters is that we learn from them. I don't hold anything against you. Life teaches us in different ways." The man nodded, his eyes moist. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small envelope. "I know you don't like taking money. This isn't a payment, it's just a small help. Maybe for your workshop. I want to do something good after the wrong I've done." Rafiq looked at the envelope but didn't reach for it. He smiled faintly. "I appreciate it, but I can't take that. What I did last night wasn't for a reward. If I start fixing cars for guilt or money, then I lose what I stand for." The man lowered the envelope slowly, feeling more respect in that moment than he had ever felt for anyone. "You're a good man," he said quietly. "Better than most of us who wear suits and pretend we've made it." Rafiq chuckled softly. "We're all just trying to make it in our own ways. Some fix cars, some run businesses. What matters is how we treat people along the way." For a moment, the two men just stood there facing each other, not as mechanic and businessman, but as equals. Something unspoken passed between them, a sense of forgiveness, a quiet understanding that both had learned something from their meeting. After a while, the man said, "If you ever need anything, anything at all, you can come to me." "I mean it," Rafiq nodded politely. "Thank you. But what I need most is respect, not favors. If you remember that, it's enough for me." The man smiled, this time genuinely. He extended his hand and Rafiq shook it firmly. The moment felt small but powerful. The workers, who had been watching quietly, smiled to themselves. It wasn't every day that someone like that came down to a small garage to apologize. Before leaving, the man took one last look at Rafiq, then at the workshop. He said softly, "You've taught me more in one night than I learned in years of business." Rafiq only smiled again. Sometimes life gives us lessons in strange ways. As the man drove away, Rafiq went back to his work. But something inside him felt lighter. Not because someone rich had apologized, but because the moment had reminded him that kindness never goes to waste. Meanwhile, the man couldn't stop thinking about the encounter. He had expected Rafiq to be cold or distant, maybe even angry. But instead he had been calm, wise, and kind. That humility left a deep mark on him. That evening, when he sat with his family, he told them the entire story. His wife and children listened quietly as he described how they had laughed at someone who had more dignity than all of them combined. His voice trembled as he spoke. "Money can buy us everything," he said, "except character." That man had it in a way I never understood until now. From that day on, he changed in small but real ways. He treated his workers better, spoke politely to the drivers and waiters, and made sure to teach his children the value of respect. People around him noticed the difference. He stopped showing off at parties and started helping people quietly, without wanting credit. As for Rafiq, his workshop slowly began to grow. Word spread about how kind and honest he was. Customers trusted him, not because of his prices, but because of his heart. He never advertised, never bragged, but people kept coming. They said there was something different about him, that he worked not just with his hands, but with his soul. Sometimes, when he sat outside the shop at sunset, sipping tea, he thought about that night. Not with bitterness, but with gratitude. Life had a way of turning things around. He had walked into that party feeling small, and walked out with something far more valuable: self-respect. A few months later, the same man who had once mocked him stopped by again, this time not for an apology or a repair, but simply to say hello. He brought his son along to meet Rafiq. "This is the man I told you about," he said to his boy. "The one who showed me what real strength looks like." The boy looked at Rafiq with admiration. Rafiq smiled and offered him a handshake. "Work hard, son," he said kindly, "and never look down on anyone. You never know who might help you when you least expect it." The boy nodded, eyes wide, as if he was meeting a hero. The man smiled too, proud that his child was learning the lesson that had once been hard for him to learn. After they left, Rafiq stood by the road for a moment, watching their car disappear into the distance. The sky above was glowing orange and gold. He felt content. Life had not made him rich in money, but it had made him rich in something far more precious: respect, peace, and the ability to forgive. That night, when he closed the shop and locked the gate, he looked up at the stars and whispered a small prayer of thanks. He had learned that sometimes dignity speaks loudest when it stays quiet. And sometimes kindness can turn even an insult into a lifelong lesson. Months passed and life slowly settled into its calm rhythm again. The seasons changed, the days grew warmer, and the workshop became busier than ever. The sound of engines, tools, and laughter filled the air from morning till evening. Rafiq had hired 2 new helpers, young boys who were eager to learn. He treated them like younger brothers, patient and kind, teaching them not just how to fix cars, but how to carry themselves with honesty and pride. Every now and then, someone would mention the story about the rich man whose car had broken down in the rain. The tale had spread quietly through the town. How the same man who once insulted the mechanic had come back later to apologize in front of everyone. People told the story not to mock the rich man, but to admire the one who had forgiven him. Rafiq never spoke much about it. Whenever someone brought it up, he would smile and say, "It's in the past. Let's look forward." That humility made people respect him even more. One morning, as he was checking a customer's engine, a delivery truck stopped by the gate. The driver handed him a letter in an envelope. It was neatly written with a familiar handwriting. It was from the same man who had once hosted that fancy party. Rafiq opened it slowly and began to read. Inside, the man had written a few short lines. He said he was starting a charity project to support poor workers and small business owners. He wanted to build a small technical training center to teach young people skills that could help them earn a living: mechanics, plumbing, and electrical work. He wanted Rafiq to lead the mechanical department, to train others, and to be a mentor for those who couldn't afford formal education. For a few moments, Rafiq just stood there reading the letter again and again. His eyes softened. It wasn't the offer itself that touched him, it was what it represented. It showed how much that man had changed. It showed that one small act of kindness had planted a seed that was now growing into something meaningful. Later that evening, when the day's work was done, Rafik sat outside the workshop on a wooden bench, the letter still in his hands. The sun was setting behind the hills, painting the sky in soft orange light. He thought about how life had come full circle, from being mocked for being a poor mechanic to now being trusted to teach others. He felt grateful. The next morning, he visited the man's office. The building was modern, with glass windows and clean walls, but inside, the atmosphere was warm and welcoming. The man greeted him with a genuine smile and offered him tea. There was no pride in his voice anymore, only respect. "I'm glad you came," he said. "This center means a lot to me. I want to give back what I once took for granted, and I can't think of anyone better than you to help me start it." Rafik looked at him quietly for a moment before speaking. "I don't know about being the best," he said humbly. "But if I can help someone change their life even a little, then I'll do it." The man nodded, his eyes filled with gratitude. "That's exactly why I came to you," he said softly. In the weeks that followed, the two men worked together on the project. The place chosen for the training center was an old warehouse on the edge of town. It needed a lot of repair, but Rafik saw potential in it. He spent days helping to design the workshop area, organizing tools, arranging workbenches, setting up machines. The rich man visited often, bringing supplies, discussing plans, and listening carefully whenever Rafik shared an idea. It was strange how life had turned enemies into partners, pride into friendship. But that was the beauty of time. It had a way of healing when people truly wanted to change. When the center finally opened, people from all around the town came to see it. There was a small ceremony, nothing fancy, just a gathering of locals, workers, and students. The man gave a short speech thanking everyone who had helped. But when it came time for him to introduce Rafik, he paused, his voice trembling slightly. He said, "There was a time when I thought money made me important. But one night in the middle of a storm, I met someone who showed me what real strength looks like. He didn't have wealth, but he had dignity, honesty, and kindness. That man is standing beside me today. Without him, this center would not exist." People turned and applauded as Rafik stepped forward, shyly nodding in thanks. He wasn't used to attention, and his face turned slightly red, but his smile was genuine. He didn't give a big speech. He simply said, "I'm not a teacher by degree, but I know what hard work feels like. If you're willing to learn, I'm willing to teach." That's all we need. The applause grew louder, not because of fancy words, but because of the honesty in his voice. As the weeks passed, the training center began to fill with young learners. Some came from poor families, some were dropouts, and some just wanted a second chance. Rafik taught them not only about engines and tools, but about respect and patience. "No job is small," he would say. "What makes a job great is how you do it." The man often visited, sometimes bringing lunch for everyone, sometimes just sitting quietly in the corner, watching Rafik teach. Every time he saw the students laughing and learning, he felt a quiet pride, not the kind that shows off, but the kind that comes from knowing you're doing something meaningful. One afternoon, when the day's class was over, he walked up to Rafik and said, "You've changed this place completely. Look at them, they come here smiling now." Rafik smiled softly. "They just needed a place where they're treated with respect." "That's all any of us ever need," the man nodded thoughtfully. "You're right. Respect, it's something money can't buy, but it can build everything else." Years went by, and the center became a symbol of hope for many. Some of the students opened their own small garages. Others found good jobs in nearby towns. They all remembered the lessons Rafik had taught them, not just about fixing cars, but about fixing one's attitude toward life. Rafik grew older, his hair grayer, his steps slower, but his spirit never changed. He still worked with the same focus and humility. The man, now more like a close friend, often visited him, sometimes bringing his grown-up children along. They would sit together in the courtyard, sharing tea, laughing about old memories, the party, the storm, the first time they met on that lonely road. Sometimes the man would say, "I still think about that night. It changed everything for me." And Rafik would reply with a warm smile, "That night changed me too. It taught me that even when people hurt you, you don't lose by being kind. You only lose when you let bitterness take over." One evening, As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting everything golden, Rafik stood outside the center, watching a new batch of students practicing. Their laughter echoed across the open yard. The air smelled of metal and hope. He took a slow breath and smiled to himself. He thought about where it all began, about that night at the grand party when he had walked in, unsure, nervous, and out of place. He remembered the humiliation, the laughter, the quiet walk home. But now, standing there surrounded by young men and women building their futures, he realized that everything had led to this. Life hadn't given him riches or fame, but it had given him something far greater, purpose. He had turned insult into inspiration and pain into progress. As he closed the workshop for the night, he looked up at the sky, which was slowly filling with stars. The cool breeze touched his face, carrying with it the faint sounds of laughter from inside. He whispered a small prayer of gratitude. Some stories don't end with revenge or grand victories. They end with quiet peace, earned through patience and kindness. Rafik's story was one of those. He had taught the world that dignity is not measured by wealth, but by character. And though years would pass and people would tell his story in different ways, everyone remembered one thing: the poor mechanic who was insulted at a party but answered with grace. The man whose next move no one ever forgot.